Thank you all very much, ladies and gentlemen. I think most of you know me, but in case you don't, I'm Denise McQuade, and I have the honour to be Ireland's Consul General here in Cardiff. And I'm really delighted to welcome you all here to the Temple of Peace this evening for the second annual Dewi Padraig Dialogue. So the event this evening arises from a commitment made in the Ireland-Wales Shared Statement and Joint Action Plan. And that was to hold an annual St. Patrick and St. David's lecture to be hosted in Wales and Ireland in alternate years. So the inaugural lecture took place in Dublin last year, so it's our turn this year. And I'm really pleased to introduce our speakers, Professor Paul O'Leary and Rae Howells. Professor Paul O'Leary is the Sir John Williams Professor of Welsh History at Aberystwyth University. And the relationship between Ireland and Wales is the focus of a very significant part of his work, including his book, Immigration and Integration, the Irish in Wales, 1798 to 1922. And so I think in many ways, Paul was almost the obvious choice to do the first Ireland-Wales lecture here in Wales. And following his lecture, Paul will be joined by Rae Howells. Rae is a poet, a journalist and a lavender farmer from Swansea. Her first poetry collection, The Language of Bees, was published by Parthian in 2022 and has been shortlisted for the Wales Book of the Year Prize 2023. So I'm sure you'll agree it's looking towards being a really interesting evening. So the lecture will focus on the work of Welsh geographer Emyr Estyn Evans. Now, I have to admit, until my first conversation with Paul about this, I had never heard of Estyn Evans. But the more he told me about his work, the more interested I became. Now, this probably isn't all that surprising because I've never met a diplomat who wasn't interested in geography. Our whole work is defined by borders. As Consul General, my competence here extends only to Wales. So as soon as I step over the border to England, my role ends. And in recent years, there has been increased discussion of borders on these islands. In Ireland, the border almost always denotes the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. But one thing that I have found really interesting since coming to Wales last year is how often the border comes up in conversation. And when it does, the border that is meant is the border between England and Wales. Now, that I was surprised by this is probably a reflection of my own slightly insular thinking. But people have been crossing borders on and between these islands for as long as there have been people here. And we often focus on Irish migration to Britain, and rightly so given its scale. However, one aspect of Estyn Evans' biography that I found so interesting was that he moved from Britain to Ireland. And this too is a feature of our shared experience on these islands. This year we mark the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. And this has offered us another opportunity to reflect on the close connections between these islands. And with the Irish and British governments as co-guarantors, Strand 3 of the agreement set up new mechanisms to formalise and underpin the shared work of supporting the process of peace and reconciliation. And most notable of these mechanisms is the British-Irish Council, which comprises representatives of the British and Irish governments, devolved institutions in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, and representatives of the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands. And the British-Irish Council facilitates cooperation on a wide range of issues for the benefit of people across these islands. One interesting point of note is at their most recent meeting, one of the topics discussed at the British-Irish Council, in fact, was about landscape. And I haven't seen the book yet, but I know there was a book of poetry published with contributions from poets across these islands on the theme of landscape. So today's lecture fits very nicely as well with the ongoing work that the British-Irish Council have been doing. In Ireland, the government's Shared Island Initiative was launched in 2020. It aims to fully realise the potential of the Good Friday Agreement by working with all communities and traditions across the island of Ireland to build a vision of a shared future. So against this background, I think it's fair to say that the title of this evening's lecture could hardly be more salient. With that, I will hand you over to Professor O'Leary for the 2023 Dewi Padraig lecture, Borders in the Mind, Landscape, Language and Politics in Ireland, Ulster and Wales. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Denise, for that very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm grateful for the invitation to speak in this second lecture in the series. And I'm grateful for Rae for agreeing to moderate the discussion afterwards. In some senses, the person I'm going to be talking about, Emyr Estyn Evans, would have been an excellent person to actually deliver one of these lectures for the reasons we've just heard. He was a geographer, although there was much more to him than that, and he established an influential way of seeing the Irish landscape during his lifetime in the 20th century. He produced a whole series of studies on different aspects of Irish landscape, history, heritage, and environment. And I think it's one tribute to the influence of that one reviewer, an Irish commentator, of his book on the Mourne Mountains of County Down, published in 1951, said that after the publication of that book, it was now no longer possible to see the Mourne Mountains except through Estyn Evans's eyes. The Mourne Mountains was a place that he clearly loved. He spent a lot of time there and had a summer home. It was a testimony, I think, not only to his observational skills, but his eloquence in describing what he saw. And it is a reminder that landscapes are not just out there, they don't just exist, but they do need to be studied and explained. Why they are like they are, how they developed, and how the people who have lived in them have lived there and created and shaped those landscapes. For Estyn Evans, reading a landscape provided a way of understanding Irish history in a way that wasn't possible using written records alone. And his view of Irish history went back many, many more centuries. So, who was Estyn Evans? We now discover that I can't use the technology. This is Emyr Estyn Evans, and this is a portrait of him at the end of his career, commissioned by his employer, Queen's University, Belfast. And I can assure you that as somebody like myself who is approaching the end of his academic career and edging towards retirement, this is not a normal thing. Universities do not usually commission portraits of members of staff. More than that, I think it's significant that he's described in a poem by the Northern Irish poet John Hewitt. He was awarded the CBE and so on. And there's a sense in which this is very much somebody who's at the height of his influence and stature. But it's also a very kind of approachable portrait. He's got there his notebook, and you can just see his signature pipe, which comes up in almost every image of him. He inspired a great deal of affection in the people who met him. The geographer Colin Thomas, for example, said that Estyn's unassuming charm dispelled potential barriers of occupation, social status, and political allegiance, with an all-embracing, humane egalitarianism. These were characteristics that stood him in good stead in Northern Ireland. One person who listened to him lecture in some of the public lectures I'll be describing in a few moments, Kathleen Boehringer, was clearly bowled over simply by listening to him. She wrote, "Professor Evans is the sort of man you'd like to have a cosy chat with in a quiet corner for the next 20 years of your life." And then, in a reference to the person who presented Desert Island Discs at the time, BBC programme, she said, "If Ray Plumley ever gives you the chance, forget the 8 gramophone records. take Professor Evans to that desert island. And in case you think she had ulterior motives, the reason why was because, as she said, he is the best of company, the most civilized discourse, the fairest weighing of evidence, and the slyest of pomposity puncturing senses of humour. As I said, these comments were made when Estyn Evans was very much at the height of his fame. His career, in academic terms, was almost entirely at Queen's University, Belfast. But he'd graduated in geography and anthropology from Aberystwyth in the 1920s and had been invited there to establish a department of geography. He was later a prime mover in the establishment of the Centre for Irish Studies at Belfast, and he became its director. And Welsh influence, I think, he also played a key part in the creation of the Ulster Folk Park, an open-air museum very similar to that which already existed at St Fagans, and St Fagans was clearly the inspiration. So if that's a brief summary of his achievements, I think we need to go back to the beginning to understand him. Evans was the product of a border culture and mentality. And my theme tonight is that upbringing on a border was very much something that stayed with him throughout his life and influenced his interpretations of Ireland. He was born in Shrewsbury in 1905 to Welsh-speaking parents. His father was a Calvinistic Methodist minister. The family moved to a village right on the border. And you may be able to just see this screen grab. It's Coedway, right up in the top left there. And you can see a pocket of the England-Wales border almost surrounding the area where he lived. Estyn and his brothers crossed that border every day to go to school in England, in a Church of England school. And that was very much a different sort of ambience to his home life. His home life was very much chapel, Calvinistic Methodist, and liberal in politics. And Estyn Evans said that it was that home background that helped him develop a sympathy for Irish home rule. In the 1920s, he described this area by saying that it was an area of transition, an intermediate area between the hill country of central Wales and the flat English plain around Shrewsbury. And he said that this area had two distinct features. The first was that over the centuries, there'd been attempts to fix a boundary, to nail down that line between England and Wales. And the second feature, he said, was the desire by ordinary people who lived there to simply disregard it and move about in their ordinary everyday lives in ways that didn't take any notice of those distinctions. The border, which on the map looks very set, it's very clear, set out, was not actually quite like that in practical life. During his lifetime and just before he was born, there were debates about how exactly this border mapped onto everyday things, such as education, where the responsibilities of one education authority ended and another began. These were not really obvious things. In 1919, when the Church in Wales was created, there was the obvious question of where do you put the border? And the diocese of the Church in Wales didn't always correspond with this line on the map. So Estyn Evans' upbringing is one in which there were fixed borders, but also a sense of flux and of change. After primary school in England, he had secondary education in Welshpool in Wales, and then, as I said, moved on to Aberystwyth. I think it's encouraging, or at least it is to me at least, that this talented geographer didn't know the way to Belfast when he was invited for interview. He had no idea that there was a ferry between Liverpool and Belfast, and so travelled to Scotland, caught the ferry at Stranraer, over to Larne, and then down to the city. This is somebody who would become one of the great interpreters of Irish geography. Of course, in moving to Belfast in the 1920s, he was moving to another part of the world where people were trying to fix borders and also trying to disregard them. Ireland had been partitioned in 1920 to 22, creating a contentious border, and a boundary commission was established to thrash out the details of where the permanent border should be, only coming to a resolution of matters in 1925. And there's a slight detail about Estyn Evans in relation to all this, which I think is really quite interesting. When he applied for the job in Belfast, he received advice from a man called Thomas Jones. Thomas Jones had been Lloyd George's deputy cabinet secretary during the negotiations over Ireland, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, in 1921. And Thomas Jones had been a promoter of the idea of a boundary commission. So borders coming out there again. It'd be interesting to know whether they discussed it. So we can say that in this early part of his life, his upbringing and his move to Northern Ireland in the 1920s, borders were an important part of his world. At Belfast, he established a distinctive interpretation of the Irish landscape and heritage. He was a geographer, yes, but he also took part in a whole series of other subjects. He took part in archaeological digs, for example. And if I can find what I've done with this here. This is him looking slightly sort of film star rugged on an archaeological dig with his wife Gwyneth in 1935 in Northern Ireland. And he began to sort of merge these different subjects into his interpretation of Irish history and landscape. Tellingly, I think, he described his work in different subjects as border crossings. The border there coming out yet again. There was one thing of this early period which I think we can be glad he didn't pursue, and that was his interpretation of Ireland that he delivered in 2 radio lectures on the BBC in April 1939. The title was, "Who Are the Irish?" And these talks basically set out a racial classification of the Irish, talking about Nordic groups, Celtic groups, and so on. The date is important here, April 1939, and perhaps we can come back in some of the talk afterwards as to where this came from and what its significance was. What I want us to do now is to focus on 3 public lectures that he delivered in the early 1970s, between 1970 and 1973, because I think they sum up a lot of important things about how he interpreted Ireland. These were called The Personality of Ireland, The Personality of Ulster, and, yes, inevitably, The Personality of Wales. Only 3 years separated these, yet I think we can see how events in Northern Ireland affected him during that period and changed important aspects of his interpretation. In some senses, this man who had been praised for the civilized discourse had really quite soured in some of his views. The term personality comes up in each of these, and Estyn Evans was using a very specific idea there, the idea of geographical personality. This was developed by a French geographer at the beginning of the 20th century, Vidal de la Blache, and he had the idea that every country and region had a distinctive geographical personality that was composed of the environment, of the culture of people who had lived there, the habitat and surroundings, and so on. And you can see the subtitle of the book, The Personality of Ireland, Habitat, Heritage, and History. So environment, cultural heritage, and history were the things that Estyn Evans was bringing together. He used archaeological evidence, he used folklore, he used geography to study what exactly had developed over the centuries. He very much took the long perspective, stretching back to prehistoric times. He was never somebody who, in some senses, respected borders, whether that was in terms of the subjects he was looking at, or in fact of the periods. So let's have a look at the first of these, and there's Estyn Evans with his pipe yet again. His lectures on the personality of Ireland are in some senses the sort of summation of his career. They sum up his interpretation of what he saw as the continuities in Irish history from the very, very early times up to the present day. And the people who represented that were the Irish peasants, in his view. It was their culture from Neolithic times down to the present that was really what was distinctive about Ireland. He talked about how during this very, very long period there had been cultures that came into Ireland, but they'd been absorbed into that basic peasant culture. His emphasis in culture here was on material culture, was on ways of working and living on the land. And I think it's important to note here that for him, it wasn't simply a question of describing rural practices. He was somebody who partook in them. He would go out and try various tools or be shown how to use various tools and various working practices. One curious feature of his writing, and it sort of comes up here, there, and everywhere, is a slight obsession. We all have our obsessions, but his obsession was spades. Yes, shovels, spades. And in his work, he had explanations of different types of spade, drawings of spades. He had maps plotting the distribution of spades and so on. And I think one thing we can say about Estyn Evans is that for him, a spade was never just a spade. When published, these lectures received a very warm reception, although one reviewer was critical of one aspect of them. One reviewer pointed out that Estyn Evans didn't include language in his idea of the personality of Ireland, that this wasn't part of the identity of the people over the centuries. And I think that omission tells us something about his upbringing on that border, Shropshire, Montgomeryshire, where you had parents who spoke Welsh, but the language was not transmitted to the son. Inevitably, Ulster was part of the discussion in these lectures, but he had set out his ideas on Ulster much more fully the previous year in some ways a quite remarkable lecture on the personality of Ulster, delivered to the Institute of British Geographers. And I think in some senses what this lecture shows is the difficulties in using landscape as a way of overcoming differences and divisions. Once again, it's extremely wide-ranging from the Neolithic to the present day. I don't think there's possibly any other publication that discusses developments knowledgeably in the Neolithic at the same time as discussing the economic policies of the Northern Ireland Parliament, which he did. And somewhat optimistically, in retrospect, he saw the Northern Ireland Parliament, as it then was, as a model for devolution in other parts of the UK. This was a suggestion that aged very quickly and would be shattered in a few years' time. His lecture on Ulster had to confront the question of divisions, and he did at one point talk about the region having a split personality. But I think it's interesting to see where he thought the divisions were. To begin with, he made the important point that when the island of Ireland was partitioned in the early 1920s, Ulster was also partitioned, with 6 counties in Northern Ireland and 3, Donegal, Cavan and Monaghan, in the Irish, what became the Republic. He also drew attention to other geographical divisions, either side of the River Bann, east and west, important cultural and physical divisions. But what's interesting about this, I think, is it would have been very easy for him to simply say, okay, the problems started in the 1920s, and he resisted that. He could even have said the problems started in the 17th century, and he resisted that. For Estyn Evans, Ulster's divisions came in the Neolithic period, a claim that I think can be seen as an almost deliberate attempt to sidestep politics and religion. So here we get an emphasis on continuity in exactly the same way as he'd set out for Ireland. It was also clear that he was opposed to nationalism. In fact, in this lecture, he blamed Roman Catholics for not taking full part in the new Northern Ireland, avoiding the fact of sectarianism and the fact that Northern Ireland had been constructed in the first place to be a Protestant state. And this isn't because he was somehow uninvolved in public life in Northern Ireland. He certainly was. This was part of the promotion of the Ulster Folk Park. He was in touch with civil servants. And there's a record of one, I think, quite remarkable conversation that took place between him and a civil servant in the Community Relations Commission in Belfast in the 1960s. The civil servant recorded later that Evans suggested bulldozing the Shankill and Falls Road parts of the city, and in their place plant is described as an urban forest park as a way of separating the two religious communities. As the civil servant dryly pointed out, we never got far enough into the discussion to find out what was to be done with the people so displaced. Even so, writing about Ulster in the early 1970s, events in that part of the world had not yet really changed his view. And I think we do begin to see that in the case of the third lecture. This was on the personality of Wales. This was delivered as a BBC radio lecture in the Cardiff studios in November 1973. And in some senses, there are elements of this that are very similar to the other two. He talks about geographical personality, a country where Wales, he says, is defined by the upland pastoral farming. And he talked about the continuities in rural Welsh life over the centuries. What's missing, of course, is anything really to do with industrial and urban Wales, which had a very different role in Welsh life than the cities and towns did in Ireland. There was also a sense in which some of his views expressed here showed perhaps a kind of proto-environmentalism. For example, he saw the big threat to a Welsh way of life as being the Forestry Commission. The Forestry Commission was destroying that pastoral farming in the uplands, and he saw that as much more detrimental than people moving in from towns and cities. So far, so similar. But in this lecture, there were important differences. To begin with, he spoke much more about himself and his upbringing. And I think it's worth quoting one or two things that he said. He said, "My prejudices are those of one of Welsh descent who was born in Shropshire and who has lived for 45 years in Ireland." He spoke in withering terms about the religion of his parents. And he talked about that border between Shropshire and Wales as being a kind of colonial situation. And then he said, "Thus one grew up familiar with two worlds and exposed to two different sets of values. I confess that I am ambivalent, not fully committed to Welshness." Once again, we get sort of really quite hostile views of the Welsh language, which I think go some way to explain his ideas of the Irish language. As well as personal matters, he also discussed his changing attitudes to Northern Ireland. During the last 4 years, he said, "My view of Ireland and of Republican nationalism in particular has been brutally shaken by witnessing many inhuman acts committed in the name of political ideology based on hatred and violence." So why this change in tone in such a short period? Well, I think the date of this lecture is crucial here. As I said, this was November 1973. Looking back, we now know that 1972, the previous year, would turn out to be the high point of killings in Northern Ireland. And those events were very fresh in his mind and clearly weighed upon him. His attitudes clearly hardened during the early 1970s. By the time of this lecture, the Northern Ireland Parliament, which he'd promoted as an idea that could be followed elsewhere, was first disbanded and then abolished in 1973. And his search for the common ground through the study of landscape and heritage must have seemed increasingly forlorn. In the second edition to his book, The Personality of Ireland, published in 1981, he seemed a bit more argumentative than he had previously been. And consciously or otherwise, he repeated the claim made by Lloyd George during the Anglo-Irish treaty negotiations of 1921 that a republic was a foreign import and alien to Gaelic culture. Implicitly, it was a strong identification with the regional identity of Northern Ireland. This was no longer feeling quite like the person you'd want to take with you to a desert island. So I think we can say that borders and border country were important to Estyn Evans. He was the product of a border, and he moved to a place where another border was very much a matter of contention. He produced a rich and eloquent interpretation of Irish heritage and landscape that challenged in many ways lots of the views of his day. And he certainly attempted to provide a cultural basis for different communities to meet on a common ground, a shared sense of environment, habitat, and material culture. Events in Northern Ireland in the 1960s and 1970s exposed some of the difficulties with that. And some of his critics have come to see him as, in some senses, constructing a longer-term history for Northern Ireland, which was, in fact, simply a product of the 1920s. In other words, creating a usable history for Northern Ireland. This, of course, allowed him to take part in the creation of new cultural institutions in Northern Ireland, the Ulster Folk Park, which I've mentioned, which served to reinforce a sense of separate regional identity from the rest of Ireland. So I think we can begin to see how the early 1970s and his concern with Ireland, Wales, and borders became increasingly unsettling to him. Cultural border crossings of the type he made central to his life became increasingly fraught with difficulty. Now that a sort of peace has returned to Northern Ireland, it might be worth perhaps revisiting some of his ideas. Not entirely sure they can be adapted simply or unproblematically to current circumstances, but his emphasis on environment is certainly something that could form the basis of a common culture. The difficulties are, of course, that the populations that he was talking about, even back in the early 1970s, were mostly rural, whereas by now most of the Irish population, north and south, live in towns and cities. What I think we can see is that this person who moved from the borderland between Wales and England took with him insights that enriched the understanding of Irish landscape and heritage, and took with him part of Wales and that borderland with him. In that respect, I think the idea of having borders in the mind is a really useful description of the way he thought and worked. Thank you.
So much, Paul, for that absolutely fascinating lecture. I was particularly taken with the phrase trying to fix borders and trying to disregard them, used towards the start of your lecture. I wonder how much of the practice of international relations can actually be encompassed with that one phrase. Plenty of scope there for discussion. I'd love to welcome Rae Howells to the stage, please, to join you.
Thank you so much, Denise, and thank you, Paul, for a very illuminating lecture, but also for introducing me to the character and the career of Estyn Evans, whom I, like Denise, have never heard of before. You mentioned him, but I've had a jolly old time reading all about him now and finding out more, so thank you for that, and hopefully this is a good introduction to the rest of the audience as well, who will be able to go off and read some more about him as well. I thought I'd start just by asking maybe an easy question, hopefully, but what is it that drew you to Estyn Evans? What's the fascination?
Well, I suppose I was sort of vaguely aware of his work, Gradually over the times I became more interested in the links between Ireland and Wales. Simply the name, Emyr Estyn Evans, struck me as a sort of potentially useful thing to look at. And then once I knew more about his personal history, it became clear that the links between Wales and Ireland were particularly important to him, even if by 1973 he was saying they were problematic. And there's an interesting aspect to the development of geography in Ireland, because almost all, I think, the professors of geography initially, back in the 1920s, had studied at Aberystwyth and were Welsh. Geography wasn't taught that widely. And so, people like Estyn Evans and others were almost kind of missionaries for their subject.
Pioneers.
Yeah.
He was the first geography lecturer in Ireland, was he? Did I read that? Or have I got that wrong?
Sorry?
Was he the first geography lecturer in Ireland? I'm sure I read that somewhere.
He might have been. He was certainly among the first.
Okay. And he took that Welsh way of thinking with him as well. Like Denise, I was really interested in that phrase that he had about the borders, and you've obviously picked up on that idea of fixed borders and our sort of human compulsion to fix borders, but then almost to want to push against them and cross them at will. It feels so very now, doesn't it, that idea, because of things like Brexit. And of course that frontier is such an important frontier when we talk about our borders with Europe now in the UK. But those things are happening across the world, aren't they? I'm thinking particularly at the moment about places like Palestine or Ukraine, where those borders are still so problematic for people. I wondered what you think Evans could tell us about some of those conflicts now. Is he still relevant?
In that respect, I think that idea of transgressing borders is an interesting one, because I think when we do fix borders, there's always a danger they turn into frontiers that people don't cross. The more difficult you make borders, the fewer people do actually bother to cross them. But the examples you've used there, I think, are relevant, because if you take most of the 20th century and look at the major border conflicts, they come from various aspects of empire and different empires. Yeah. So there's Palestine, there's Northern Ireland, there's Kashmir, and so on. And Ukraine is really about Russian imperialism and the Russian Empire, not being able to let go. And he used the word colonial to describe the condition of the England-Wales border at one point. He didn't develop that point, but you get a sort of sense that he was thinking about empire too. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I was really interested as well in what you were saying about that really long view that he took, kind of interpreting modern events, but from a Neolithic perspective. Do you think he was too fixated on the past? And, you sort of alluded to that. Maybe he was missing things that were happening in the present that were maybe just as relevant as, or more relevant than what he'd noticed about those old borders. Well, it's an interesting point. I mean, I think it's worth looking at where he got that from. He was very much inspired. He wrote a book quite early on French geography, he was clearly inspired by a lot of French writers and thinkers. And one particular group in the 1920s, around a person called Marc Bloch, developed this idea that the only real knowledge you could have about the past, the fundamental knowledge about the past, was something that really went back many, many, many centuries. You had to, anything, they didn't quite put it in the sense of, politics and so on is froth, but that's not far from I think, the approach. And he was very much inspired by this. And it allowed him to develop his analysis of geography, archaeology, folklore, all those things, played to that long, long perspective. So I think, in one sense, it wasn't a neglect of the present. It was an attempt to try and find where he thought the important things were in the continuity over the centuries. And of course, he did get involved with civil servants in all sorts of projects in Northern Ireland, the Ulster Folk Park, the commission in Belfast in the 1960s, and his remarkable idea for an urban forest.
Yeah, I love that. Although those poor people, where would they have gone?
Exactly.
Tree houses, perhaps.
Yes. Well, I think the idea of the urban forest was to keep them apart. So you would have had to move people out.
Okay.
But as the civil servant said, they never quite got round to that.
Thankfully, perhaps.
Yeah.
Was he trying to avoid talking about those problems? I mean, you've kind of answered that, I think, but was there a sort of part of, I suppose I work on the land as well, and I sort of yearn for this simple life. Was there a sort of romanticism in him, do you think? Was he yearning for the simple life and trying to avoid some of those messy conflicts?
Yeah, I'm sure that was part of it. You get the impression that he sort of lost his temper in the 1970s when it came to having to confront what was going on in life around him, and he just didn't like it. And I suspect that constitutionally he wasn't tuned to politics.
It wasn't his thing, was it?
Yeah, I think he might have worked as a technocrat, but I don't think he could have coped with day-to-day politics.
Yeah, sure. We've been talking about him having sort of a selective view in a way, but he also had this really interesting multidisciplinary approach, didn't he, where he sort of drew on loads of different humanities subjects, really, and he had fingers in lots of different pies. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, I think the interesting thing is that first of all, he graduated in geography and anthropology. So there were two subjects there, and I suspect the second one is something that's going to come up, a bit later. But he was also, active in archaeological circles. He published in archaeology magazines. He recorded folklore and so on. And he had this sort of sense that you had to understand a society in its entirety, and that lots of academic subjects just understood slices of them. So
was that quite innovative at the time then?
It was both traditional and innovative, because in a sense in the 19th century people hadn't really respected those kind of disciplinary boundaries all that much.
Okay.
And the 20th century was very much universities sort of embedding particular subjects in particular departments.
So he was crossing borders, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was on another border, yeah. And he was sort of breaking out of that.
Right.
When he helped establish the Institute of Irish Studies, that was very definitely to be different subjects. It wasn't just one. And again, that was his vision of how you studied Ireland.
Wonderful. I thought perhaps that part of his attempt, and we've sort of skirted around this, but to be a bit more maybe definite about it. Do you see him as a peacemaker? Because there was a lot of stuff that he talked about around finding common ground and finding commonalities. Do you think he was looking for a way, to push all of those conflicts to one side and find a way for people to find what they shared with each other?
Yeah, I think that's very much the case. I think it's in The Personality of Ireland, in the introduction to that. He does talk about how taking students on field trips and going on archaeological trips with people of different cultural, religious and political backgrounds had this marvellous effect on them. And everybody got on, and they studied the same thing. It was a shared heritage, and I think he very much wanted that. He wanted to see the sort of environment, the history, his particular type of history of Ireland as that shared heritage.
Was he a bit impatient? Because there was a lot of chat in one of his lectures about myths and how he found that people were sort of carrying and harbouring these myths that weren't necessarily true. They didn't relate to the truth of the matter. So was that part of the attempt, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, he saw his activities very much as scientific, and he did publish in some scientific journals, and there was a very clear divide in his mind between, that kind of scientific activity, objective, looking at material things, and what he saw as the myths that had fueled modern Irish history. And again, it came out in his aversion to nationalism. Didn't talk about unionism, as far as I can see. But it was certainly directed in that way.
Interesting then that he didn't really talk about language, isn't it? And he didn't see that because it's such a huge part of a culture. Very interesting that he was so dismissive of it. Do you think that was sort of, I'm thinking back to the story of the Welsh language and how that was very much dismissed through the sort of 60s and 70s and the fight that was ongoing to save it and keep it. Do you think he was sort of just part of that culture of dismissing languages? And
well, he did at one or two points refer to it and sort of said, well, this cannot be the basis for a common culture. And he sort of, again, he went into the deep past, of sort of Gaelic history in an attempt to try to prove this. And I do think the only really convincing way of explaining this is his own personal history.
Yeah.
And the way in which, his parents were Welsh speaking and he wasn't.
Do you think he had a chip on his shoulder about it?
I think it went deeper than a chip.
Okay. Okay. Talk to me about climate change, because a lot of what you alluded to this in your lecture, there's a lot about the environment and the way people are shaped by their environment in his writings. But of course, environmentalism as we know it wasn't really being talked about at the time. So do you think you could apply what he was talking about? Would he be excited now, do you think, to be talking about those issues?
Well, that's an interesting question, because there are the odd comments in some of his works where he's sort of a little bit dismissive of ecologists, as they were then called. And I think he sort of saw them as faddists and this sort of thing. But nevertheless, there are aspects of his work that do suggest that he was beginning to think in that direction. For example, his stuff about the Forestry Commission, destroying an upland way of life, can be seen very much in those terms.
He was putting people at the centre of it rather than thinking bigger about the environment, wasn't he?
Yeah. I think the difficulty he would have with climate change is that he was all about continuity with the past. And in many ways what we've come to understand is the discontinuity from the Industrial Revolution onwards, and how that has affected climate and landscape and so on. So I think he'd have to adjust his views quite a lot to get there.
Yes, interesting. I want to pick up something again that you alluded to around something that I found a bit jarring when I read some of his writings as well, about the way he was classifying people. There was talk of measuring heads but tracing people, groupings of people through their blood groups. He's very scathing about the Irish who emigrated to America, for example. He really did like to characterise groups of people, didn't he? Do you think that that's problematic for us now? Because it's so jarring to the modern era, I would even say it's racist, really. Yeah. So would you agree with that? And do you think that he still has something valid to say?
I think that's the one aspect of the early work that he wrote about that, just has to be jettisoned completely. And I think the explanation for it comes from that anthropology dimension to what he studied, because it was physical anthropology. And his tutor, H.J. Fleur, who became a very close friend of his, was very much into those ideas. Now, he was professor of geography, H.J. Fleur, but he'd started out as a professor of zoology. And it would appear that he sort of had this determination to scientifically, in inverted commas, just classify people. The interesting thing, I think, is that for both Fleur and Estyn Evans, They very, very clearly opposed the sort of uses of these kind of ideas on the continent in the 1930s. H.J. Fleur was a Channel Islander, and the Channel Islands were invaded, of course, and he was involved in helping Jewish refugees and so on. And they were appalled at the way these ideas were used. But I think, these are just ways of thinking that have no relevance whatsoever to our modern world.
Now, yeah, absolutely. I'm going to ask you the killer question now, because while I was reading, I hope it's a killer question anyway, maybe it's not. Please stay with me. I think when I was reading some of what Estyn was writing about borders and the way environment shapes people, and his idea that those divisions were there long before today's modern politics, and so in other words the landscape has shaped these divisions. Does that mean we're doomed? Are we doomed to keep on making these same mistakes, to keep having these divisions, that we can never heal along those borders or those splits in the landscape?
Well, that's a curious thing about it, isn't it? Because he did have what appeared to be a kind of geographical determinist view, but he also explicitly rejected that. So I suppose you could take from it that he was talking about the interaction of people with their environment, rather than simply having to do what the environment told them they had to do. But of course, if you're talking about a peasant culture, which he saw as central to it all, the extent to which you can change that environment is inevitably somewhat limited. So I think there is a kind of contradiction in his thought at that point.
Maybe another rejection of modernity, perhaps, as well, that actually we do shape our landscape so much now, don't we, through cities and building and all of that. Okay, well, thank you so much. That's really fascinating. And I'm sure you've all got burning questions for Paul as well. We have got a roving mic, apparently. So if you have a burning question, will you wave at me vigorously? We've got a gentleman in the back over there.
Hello? Yes, sorry.
Perfect.
Tim Saunders. I was reading Celtic Studies at Aberystwyth in the early 70s, and so I was obviously coming across papers of Emrys Evans, and I'd like to thank Paul for opening my eyes to a side of his personality I couldn't have guessed at. By the way, I beg to differ with Denise. The honour is entirely ours that she and her talented staff are on post here. I hope they find it worth their while. Anyway, I mean, one of my memories of Emrys Evans, what he was most known for amongst my generation, was these toe-curling articles he had published on the Western Mail, in which he depicted his cultural background as like something out of Craddock Evans, and sort of savage attacks on any proposal to improve the status of the Welsh language and of people who spoke it. I'm wondering, does he make more sense if we see him in the context of a generation? You think of people like Gronwy Rhys or George Thomas, or Gwyn Thomas is another prime example, where sort of the transmission of the language had stopped just before them. He was obviously, from his articles, quite exuberantly sort of ill-informed. And sort of the Welsh language sort of becomes sort of a bit like Judaism in some of Marx's writings, a sort of a black hole into which he sort of pours everything he detests. I mean, do you think it makes more sense in the context of his generation?
Yes, I think that the generation is important. He obviously grew up at a time when there weren't as many ventures to safeguard the Welsh language, Welsh language schools and all the rest of it. But I do think that the personal dimension, I think actually the personal dimension in almost all of the people you described there, George Thomas, Gwyn Thomas and so on, is important too. And this sort of sense of a kind of fracturing between one generation and the next, that an older generation Their parents speak Welsh, but they don't. And that has a big impact on their identity. I mean, this is not to say that people have to respond in that way. No. Not everybody did. But I think that's the context in which it can be seen, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, you mentioned Fleur. I remember E.G. Bowen, although he's retired, he was often working in the National Library, and I remember overhearing a talk. He was chatting at the next table with somebody in the canteen, saying when he was a student, and acting as translator for Fleur while he was sort of going around measuring people's heads. And sort of one day, sort of Fleur said, "What are they saying when we arrive?" He said, I don't think you want to know. Fleur said, "Yes, you must tell me." He said, they said, "Here's the mad professor again." Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Have we got any more questions? Anybody want to ask something? Oh, we've got someone over here.
I just wondered if you could speak a bit more about the personality of Ulster and how Esther Evans viewed the creation of the board of the 6 and the 9 counties, which creates nation-state borders, but also new provincial borders, with this of Ulster without the UK, but also being part of Ireland, but also still having its own provincial borders.
Well, yeah, that's a very good question, because I think that, when he talked about the personality of Ulster, he was explicit that he was talking about the historic province, that is, the 9 counties. And that it was in that context that he made the point that Ulster had been partitioned as well as Ireland. But I think what you begin to see in his analysis is he eventually ends up narrowing it in the present day to Northern Ireland. And there is a sense, I think, in which that was never a fully resolved part of his thought. If you're going to talk about, the continuity over the centuries, then the 1920s is a bit of a discontinuity. And he sort of glossed over that, really. And some people have seen him, not just him, but a number of other thinkers at the time, as sort of almost generating a longer history for what was a new political project.
Thank you. Oh, we've got a question over here. Did something bad happen? No, you're okay.
Thank you so much for that, Paul. Looking at Esther Evans, and the way you described him, I see more than a little of similarity with your Werth Pete. Of course, folk museums, that Ulster Folk Museum. And I was wondering, and also the fact that they both completely ignored the industrial, character of the area where they were living, whilst, of course, your Werth Pete realised that the museum had to be there to get the punters in. So were there connections, or did they, in parallel ways, draw both on that Scandinavian tradition, or how did that work in the 1930s?
Right, that's a very interesting question. I'm not, at the moment at least, aware of specific connections between the two. But when we look at the lecture on the personality of Wales, and when Esther Evans is talking about the continuities of Welsh peasant, upland culture, his stuff about the Welsh house and so on is all Pete. It's all his work. So he clearly sympathised with some aspects of it. And I think it's very much the case that the Ulster Folk Park was inspired by St Fagans. So the precise connections between the two, I, at the moment, am unable to chart at the moment, but clearly Esther Evans read Pete's work, and it influenced him a great deal when he was writing about Wales and what he thought about Wales. Whether it influenced what he thought about Ireland is another thing.
Oh, we have a question over there, towards the back.
Thanks very much. That was very interesting and something a person I know nothing about, so thank you. You touched on this a little bit in your discussion, and I was interested. It seems to be this tension between he's keen to take this kind of long view, like you're saying, what's important is kind of what was in the Neolithic past, and then kind of things like industry, class, nationalism, quite a lot gets sort of pushed a little bit to the side because it's not where he focuses. But this seems in huge tension with, if borders and bordering are like a snag in his thinking, and he, as you say, like then he has to think about colonialism and colonial logics, and that's a more modern phenomenon, then how does he, do you think, does he acknowledge this tension at all in his work? And if there are lessons for any of us?
I'm sorry, I've missed a little bit of what you said. Could you say that again,
okay.
please?
It seems there's a tension between, he's focused on the long view, the Neolithic past, and he avoids some kind of aspect, some more modern aspects like industry or class or nationalism that he doesn't think are as important. But then he's interested in borders and bordering and colonialism as a result, and that is arguably a more kind of modern thing. Mm-hmm. Does he acknowledge this tension in his work, or is there any lessons in this for those of us who would be dealing with sort of similar tensions in our work, do you think?
That's a very interesting question. I don't think he, in a sense, explicitly talks about borders as part of the modern world, although he does have a small piece where he mentions the attempt to fix a border over the past 4 centuries, which I suppose could be regarded as, some sort of statement about that. But I think his whole thing about disregarding borders is very much an attempt to sort of say, well, these borders shouldn't be fixed. But clearly, there are other sorts of borders. I mean, the obvious border in Wales would be between rural and urban, and he never addressed that. It is a very curious aspect of his work that almost, the modern world, it'd be wrong to say it doesn't exist, but it's just this thing in the background, that he doesn't really think is important. What's really important is what's happened over the many centuries and how these things have developed over time. So modernity, I suppose, he would see as a discontinuity rather than continuity. And he wasn't really interested in that because it didn't fit his pattern of thought. I don't know if that sort of answers your question.
I think there was a question just a couple of rows in front. There we go.
Thank you. It's been very interesting, and your talk has caused me to reflect on the interaction between borders and devolution. In terms of, if you like, any administration requires an edge. We're responsible for this bit, we're not responsible for that bit. And there are times where that boundary, if you like, is either a hard geographical feature or something like that, where it's mountains or it's sea or whatever, so it's obvious that's where our edge is. And then there are other times where, like the picture, the map you're showing, someone's drawn a line down the middle of a field or something like that and said, that's the edge. Mm-hmm. And those kind of borders are much more difficult for real people to observe as a genuine border, because, well, that's where I walk my dog, or I go to a shop over there, or whatever. So I was thinking, that administrative boundary is much, much tougher when it's an artificial border. And of course, we spent, in this country, the last sort of 40 years trying to merge and do away with our borders. But that has caused some people to worry about remoteness and loss of control and, it's too far away. So now we've gone in the opposite direction. No, we must have a border. This is us, that's them. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering on your reflections of that and, anything that Estyn Evans' work can tell us about how we solve our problems nowadays.
Well, that's another interesting question. I'm not entirely sure that his work could give us a lead on solving the problems. But one of the things that did cross my mind when preparing this, it would be interesting to know what he would make of the idea of a trade border in the Irish Sea. Because his borders are all sort of physical geography, effectively. What about a border in the Irish Sea? I know that sort of people here have written about the Irish Sea region and so on, and the crossings that have taken place. But that, in a sense, speaks to your point about how you fix a border. Where exactly would that border be in a sea that's moving all the time? How would you actually delineate that? I mean, there are borders in the sea, but it becomes a lot more difficult. And I think perhaps his work would sort of, I may be doing him a disservice, but I think he would be much more in the category of a land border in that respect. Even though he sort of emphasised the sort of crossings all the time. I suppose that actually is one of the points, isn't it? If you haven't got a border, you can't cross it. So you've got to have borders in order to cross them. And perhaps that's what his work is all about.
But was it a border of the mind? Would that Irish Sea border be a border of the mind?
Oh, that would definitely be a border of the mind, yeah.
And GPS has changed the game as well, hasn't it?
Yes.
We've got someone towards the front here with a question as well, I think. Did you have a question? Here we go.
I was struck very much when you were talking about Estyn Evans' ideas, that anthropological sense of liminal space, where the edges meet at the border and where ideas seep across. And it seemed to me that one of the things you were talking about was how he resisted a temporal border, and hence he had this continuity of time, but he could never quite resist a spatial border, being a geographer maybe. And he created his own borders, I think, from how you describe it, in terms of constructing a spatial sense which left out the urban, which left out the lowlands, which left out the borders, the political borders, and how they shaped. And when you were reflecting on the work, did you reflect on different senses of borders around time and space? Because it did come across very strongly to me, and I thought fascinating.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think the whole point about his period in the 1920s, when he makes this move from Wales to Northern Ireland, is that these borders were actually in flux all over the place. People were trying to pin them down, and even when they had pinned them down, there was still uncertainty as to who had responsibility one way or the other. And so setting them out on a map, in the way that I did there and the way he did in his maps, was only part of the story. It was about the contentious nature of borders and how people resist having those borders sort of very deeply in the ground. And that, I think, is where the imagination comes in, and people's desire to have the border not there but there, or no border at all, or a deeper border or a taller border, And I think those are things that his work edged around without really necessarily actually resolving at any time.
Thank you. Have we got any more questions? We have got we've got a repeat question at the back. A repeat question, are we allowed?
I mean, the points that members of the audience have been making about the definition of borders makes me wonder, would it be helpful to take a cue from linguistic geography? because there are no sort of hard borders in linguistic geography. You know, if you'd been led if in 1900 you'd been led blindfolded from Dunkirk, walking most of the way to Danzig, you couldn't have told when you were crossing a border. You know, you'd have maybe come to a fence between two gardens with two neighbours chatting in the local dialect. One of them would have had a copy of Luther's Bible in his house, and the other one would have a copy of the States General Bible in his house. And you know, if you look at the linguistic geography of Wales, for example, I mean, there is no hard border between, say, the dialect of Carmarthenshire and the dialect of Pembrokeshire. What linguistic geographers do, they trace what we call isoglosses, which are sort of the approximate boundaries between sort of different features, say the distribution of a particular word or a particular pronunciation or a grammatical form. And they never all run together. You know, at the best, the most definite you can hope for is sort of bundles of isoglosses. There's a sort of a transitional zone, and sort of different borders serve for different purposes. I mean, you know, I can think of sort of in terms of Ireland. My mother and brother actually are buried in Armagh, and got to know their neighbours very well. And you know, I know a lot of unionist people, if they're flying out somewhere, will go via Dublin for the simple reason that the traffic into Belfast is so terrible. You know, it's often sort of very sort of simple things like that. So, yes.
This reminded me a lot of Estyn Evans did like a map, didn't he?
Oh, yes.
And I was struggling to see some of the patterns that he was talking about in some of them, but he really was quite interested in burial types and what that said about the landscape and the peoples that would have been there.
Yeah.
He did love a map, so
Yes.
that sounds very much like that, actually.
Well, as I said, he does somewhere have a map of spades. Yeah.
Does he? I'd like to see it, to be honest. Do we have any more questions? Oh, we've got one down the front here. Who's closest?
Thanks a lot. This is going to be a very brief question. How was he viewed in the Republic across the border? Was he seen by the political elite and by the intellectual, by the intelligentsia of the Republic?
That's a very good question, actually, because one of the Welsh geographers who set up the geography department, I think it was in Dublin, clearly they sort of got on, but he was very critical about all this stuff Estyn Evans did, you know, including archaeology and folklore and all the rest of it, and why didn't he stick to geography? But there is a sense in which some of the work that Estyn Evans was doing was creating sort of parallel structures to what was going on in the Free State and then the Republic. And there was a sort of respect, I think, from other academics, but also not entirely fulsome. You know, there was a sort of sense, well, he's creating different structures here. Why do you need to do that? You could actually join our structures. So, you know, separate academic journals, separate publications and so on, instead of joining in with people in the South. So his relationship was not always an easy one, I think. And there were times when people criticised him for sort of trying to create this identity for Northern Ireland that they said didn't exist.
Okay, are we done? Have we got any more questions for Paul? Oh, we do. We have another one. Oh, there's always one, isn't there?
Quick. Just a quick one. You mentioned earlier there when speaking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, about the Republic, the Irish Free State. It was about mythology and a rejection of mythology. I'm just when you're on about mythology there, what specifically are you on about? Is is that more gone towards his opinions maybe towards religion, given his own background and Catholicism, or is that actually focused on the idea of using mythology to sort of encourage people into nationalism or so forth, which may have been used in the Irish Republic at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was quite wide-ranging in a sense. He stuck very closely to a view that nationalism is based on historical myths, and that you have to have a scientific history to show what really happened in his view. So that was his starting point. And he saw the Easter Rising, for example, without actually mentioning these events. It was clear that he saw the Easter Rising and the Civil War as, part of this, prompting people to do violent things. But there was also the sense, I think, in which he tried increasingly by the 1970s and 80s to pin down certain things. So he became very heavily invested in this idea that it was a myth to say that you can have a common culture based on the Irish language, and he went into the history of that. He also went into the question of Catholicism and religion, although interestingly, his background in a Protestant home was one that he rejected. In his lecture on the personality of Wales, he says that he basically chucked it all in the moment he left for university. But I suppose you can sort of see a kind of cultural Protestantism of a residual kind. So I think he basically saw himself as a sort of scientific investigator, and myths are not the kind of thing that you deal with. But it was also linked to specific political circumstances. Okay.
Thank you. I think that, are we done? We are done. Thank you so much, Paul. That was fantastic. I think Denise is going to come back now.
And thank you very much, Paul and Rae, for a fantastic discussion. I think everyone can join me in a round of applause. It was a really fantastic discussion and so interesting, and I think there's been all sorts of ideas for future lectures, from development of museums in Ireland and Wales, transmission of languages in Ireland and Wales, but I also thought anthropological studies in Ireland and Wales. There's a very rich history in Ireland of such studies being done around the same time in the late 19th and early 20th century, and I suspect some of the experience might be quite similar, and some of the reactions of some of the subjects of those studies might also be quite similar. It remains only, again, to thank our speakers, to thank all of you for coming and for your interesting questions, and of course to thank my team, Niall Veal, my Vice Consul, Luke Webber, and especially Fred Till, who has done the lion's share of the work in organising this evening. So thank you all so much, and please do stay around and join us for a drink and continue the conversation.